Cold water doesn't wash out fear. That was the first thing Mave learned the morning she found boot prints in the mud outside her door. 3 sets. Deep-heeled, circling the cabin like something had been measuring the distance between her walls and the tree line. She hadn't heard them in the night. That was the part that sat wrong, lodged beneath her sternum like a splinter she couldn't reach. She was a light sleeper. 3 years of living alone on the eastern slope of the Cascades had sharpened her into something close to feral. She woke at owl calls, at the creak of settling timber, at the particular silence that fell when the creek stopped running. She hadn't heard 3 men walk around her home in the dark, which meant they were practiced at not being heard. Mave set the water bucket down on the porch and looked at the prints again. The morning was gray and bone cold, the kind of damp Pacific Northwest chill that seeped through wool and found the marrow. Her breath made small, pale ghosts in the air. The pines on the ridge above her were black against a sky the color of old pewter. She went inside and loaded the rifle. She didn't run. Running was an invitation, and she had learned early that the wilderness, both the natural kind and the human kind, responded to invitation. She fed the stove, boiled water, and sat at the table with the rifle across her knees and her coffee going cold in the cup while she thought through the geometry of her situation. The nearest neighbor was 11 miles south. The logging road that connected her property to the main trail was a single muddy track through dense fir. If she left now, on foot, in this weather, carrying what she needed, she'd be exposed in open terrain for most of the morning. She stayed. They came back at midday, when the light was flat and sourceless, that particular gray that made distances hard to judge. There were 3 of them, just like the prints. They came up the logging road in no hurry, 2 on horseback and 1 driving a mud-caked wagon that listed badly to the left. The man on the lead horse was lean and deliberate, wearing a yellow canvas slicker that had once been bright but had faded to the color of old mustard. He had the kind of face that had been handsome once and had curdled into something meaner with time. He smiled when he saw her standing on the porch. She didn't smile back. "Broken axle about a mile down," the man in the yellow slicker said. He pulled up at the edge of the yard and rested his wrists on the saddle horn, easy as a man who had all the time in the world, wondering if you had a spare wheel pin. "I don't," Mave said. "Might be worth checking." "It isn't." His smile didn't shift. It just stopped reaching his eyes, which had been the case from the start. The second rider, wide through the shoulders, with a red beard that hadn't been trimmed since autumn, had already drifted sideways, angling his horse toward the corner of the cabin where the woodpile stood. The man on the wagon hadn't moved, but his hands weren't on the reins anymore. Mave raised the rifle. "You can water your horses at the creek," she said, her voice entirely flat. "Then you need to go." Yellow Slicker put his hands up in a slow, theatrical display of innocence. "Now, miss, I'm not your miss. I'm not your miss." "Fair enough." He tilted his head. The smile was gone now, replaced by something she recognized as the real expression he'd been wearing underneath it all along. Patient. Certain. Accustomed to getting what he wanted because he was willing to wait for the right moment, and most people weren't. "Thing is, we've been riding since before dawn. My boys are hungry and cold, and you've got a warm stove in there. I can smell it from here." "Then you know there's fire in the stove," Mave said, "which means I can keep warm after you're gone." Redbeard laughed. It was a short, ugly sound. She pulled the trigger. The shot went wide of Yellow Slicker's horse by 3 inches, which was exactly where she aimed it. The animal screamed and reared. Yellow Slicker grabbed the saddle horn with both hands, his composure cracking for the first time. Redbeard's horse spun sideways, colliding with the wagon. In the chaos, Mave ran for the door. She made it inside. She made it to the heavy iron bolt. She almost got it into the bracket. The door hit her like a wave. The wood slammed back into her shoulder and sent her into the wall, her head cracking against the log hard enough to turn the world white at the edges. She lost the rifle. She heard it skitter across the floorboard somewhere behind her. The room tilted. She grabbed the edge of the table, hauling herself upright. But Redbeard was already through the door, and he was faster than a man that size had any right to be. He caught her by the back of her coat. Mave didn't scream. She twisted, drove her elbow into his chin, and felt the impact travel up her arm to her teeth. He grunted, and his grip loosened just enough. She wrenched free, lunged for the kitchen shelf. Not for the rifle. She couldn't see the rifle, but for the cast-iron pot sitting on the cold side of the stove. She swung it backhand, felt it connect with something, heard a satisfying crack. But there were still 3 of them. Yellow Slicker came through the door with his revolver already drawn. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply looked at her with that patient, certain expression and said, "Put it down." She didn't put it down. He shot the pot out of her hands. The concussion in the small room was enormous. The force of it knocked the iron from her grip, and the shock traveled up both arms, numbing her fingers to the elbow. Her ears rang a sustained, merciless whine. She was on her knees on the floorboards without knowing how she got there, and Yellow Slicker's boot was on her wrist before she could push herself back up. The pressure was grinding and absolute. "There," Yellow Slicker said almost gently. "See. Easy." She didn't stop fighting. She clawed at his boot, at the floor, at the air. She bucked and twisted and made herself as difficult to hold as possible because the alternative was lying still, and she had made a decision 3 years ago when she came to this mountain that she would never lie still for anything ever again. The thought of what was coming was a black, swallowing weight, but beneath it was something harder and hotter, something that refused. She was still fighting when the outside wall of the cabin shook, not the door. The wall. The sound was massive. A single impact, like something very large had decided to stop walking around obstacles and go through them. The logs groaned. The iron hook on the wall swung on its nail. Yellow Slicker's boot lifted off her wrist as he spun toward the door. The door came off its hinges. He filled the frame so completely that for a moment the gray afternoon light disappeared entirely. He had to duck to clear the top of the doorway, and even then his shoulders brushed both sides. He wore a heavy wool coat gone rough with use, and he moved with the unhurried, deliberate gravity of something that had decided this situation was finished, and was simply here to confirm it. Mave lay on the floor and watched. She watched him cross the room in 4 steps and take Yellow Slicker by the front of his shirt with one hand. She watched Yellow Slicker swing the revolver up. She watched the large man catch the gun hand at the wrist, squeeze once, and listen to the weapon hit the floor. Yellow Slicker didn't make a sound. He just went white, the color draining from his face in one rapid retreat, because there are moments when a human animal recognizes it is in the presence of something categorically different, and this was one of those moments. What came next was not a fight. It was barely even a conversation. Yellow Slicker went down. Redbeard tried to run and made it as far as the porch steps. The 3rd man, the wagon driver, was still standing in the doorway with his hands raised before anyone addressed him at all. The large man looked at him for a moment with an expression of complete disinterest, then stepped past him like a piece of furniture. "Walk," he said. His voice was very low and very certain. "Don't look back." The wagon driver walked. He didn't look back. Mave was still on the floor. She pulled herself up by the table leg, slowly, cataloging damage as she went. The wrist he'd ground under his boot ached deeply but moved. Her head throbbed where it had hit the wall. Her shoulder from the door was already stiffening into something that would make the next week miserable. Her ears were still ringing from the gunshot. By the time she was upright, he had dragged the unconscious Redbeard out the door and was standing in the wrecked frame, his back to her, looking at the yard. She found the rifle under the table. She pointed it at him. He turned around slowly when she cocked the hammers, and he looked at the barrel with the expression of a man who has done something and is waiting to see how it lands. He didn't raise his hands right away. He just looked at her, really looked the way people rarely did, without calculation or dismissal, and then he raised them. "They're gone," he said. "Don't come inside." He didn't move. He stood in the broken doorway with the cold coming in around him, his hands at shoulder height, and he waited. He had the patience of geology. She kept the rifle on him until her arms began to shake, not from weakness, but from the particular vibration that follows extreme adrenaline, the body's delayed invoice for what it has just done, and then she lowered it a few inches. "Who are you?" she said. It wasn't really a question. It came out too flat for that. "Boone," he said. "Boone what?" "Just Boone." She stared at him. He stared back. His eyes were a gray-green that reminded her of the river at this time of year, cold and carrying depth. "Where'd you come from?" He tilted his head slightly toward the ridge above the cabin. "Up." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she lowered the rifle to her side, not putting it down, just pointing it at the floor instead of at him. Her legs were shaking. She didn't want to sit down in front of him, but she needed to, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She sat on the edge of the table. "You can come in," she said. "Stay where I can see you." He stepped through the destroyed doorway and looked at it with a brief, assessing expression, the way a carpenter looks at work that needs doing. "I can set that back," he said. "I know how to set a door." "Yep," he said simply, with no argument in it at all. She watched him survey the damage to the room. The overturned chair, the dent in the log wall where her head had connected, the scorch mark on the floor where the shot had hit. He was quiet in the way that mountains are quiet, not empty, just undisturbed by the need to fill space with sound. "Why did you stop?" she asked. He looked at her. "I was checking my trap line up on the North Fork. Heard the shot." "People don't stop," she said. "People hear things in these woods and they go the other way." Boone moved to the overturned chair and set it back on its feet, not asking permission. "I know," he said. "So why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. Not avoiding the question, she could tell the difference, just finding the honest answer rather than the fast one. He picked up the cast-iron pot from the floor and set it back on the stove. "Because I know what it sounds like," he said, "when someone's fighting alone." She didn't ask him what he meant. Not then. She let him set the door back in its frame, bracing it with a length of timber until the hinges could be properly reseated. She boiled water and didn't offer him any because her hands weren't steady enough yet to pour without embarrassing herself. And she refused to be embarrassed in her own home. He seemed to understand this without being told, because he didn't ask. When the door was braced and the worst of the debris cleared, he stood in the middle of the room and looked at her. "I'll sleep on the porch," he said. "You don't need to do that. Those men might come back with friends." She wanted to tell him they wouldn't. She wanted to believe it, but the prints in the mud this morning had been practiced and deliberate, and Yellow Slicker had the look of someone who kept accounts. "There's a barn," she said finally. "It's not heated, but it's out of the weather." He nodded. No negotiation, no wounded pride. "I'm Mave," she said. "I know," he said. "Saw your name on the property marker at the bottom of the road." He went out to the barn. She sat in the chair by the stove with the rifle across her knees and the fire snapping and listened to the wind come down off the ridge. And for the first time in a long time, the wind didn't sound like something waiting for her to get tired. She didn't sleep, but she rested, which was different, and she hadn't done that in years. Morning brought hard frost and a silence from the direction of the barn that she told herself she wasn't listening for. She went out at first light and found him already awake, sitting against the outer barn wall with a piece of elk hide across his knees that he was working with a bone needle. He had a fire in the small iron camp stove she kept in the barn for the horse, and the horse was looking at him with the suspicious equanimity of an animal that has decided to provisionally accept something. "You're good with the needle," she said. "Had to learn," he said. "No one else up there to do it." She looked at the ridge. The peaks above the tree line were still lost in cloud. "How long have you been up there?" 5 years, give or take. "Trapping?" "Mostly." some hunting, some just. He paused, pushing the needle through the hide, quiet. She understood that. She didn't say so. Over the following days, a pattern established itself without either of them announcing it. He chopped wood, she baked. He mended the door properly, resetting the hinges with hardware she hadn't known she had, which meant he'd found her supply cache in the barn and organized it without asking, which should have annoyed her and somehow didn't. She checked his work and it was done right, every mortise clean, every screw seated flush. They ate at opposite ends of the table and didn't talk much. On the fourth night, she asked him. They were sitting by the stove. The wind outside doing the thing it did in November, throwing itself against the walls in long, irregular gusts. She had a piece of darning in her hands that she wasn't really working on. He had his knife and a piece of pine he was shaving down to nothing. "You said you know what it sounds like," she said, "when someone's fighting alone." He didn't look up from the wood. He didn't pretend not to know what she was referring to. 3 winters ago, he said. I was running the high trap line, up above where the snowpack's in. Ice shelf gave way. He paused. I went down about 40 feet into a creek bed. Both ankles. The left one was. He set the pine down and looked at his hands. Compound fracture. Bone outside the skin. Mave was very still. Temperature was dropping, he said. I knew I couldn't wait. Nobody up there to wait for, so I said it myself. He said this with no dramatization, the way you say a thing that happened and that you survived and that you don't need sympathy for anymore. Took me 2 days to get back to the cabin. Crawling the last mile, dragging that leg. He picked up the pine again. Thing is, he said quietly, the pain wasn't the worst part. The worst part was understanding, really understanding, down in the marrow of it. That if I died in that creek bed, no one would know for months, maybe longer. He shaved a long curl of wood onto the floor, not because no one cared, just because there was no one there. And I had chosen that. I'd walked away from every person who'd ever tried to stay close to me and climbed up the mountain alone. And I told myself it was because I was better at being alone than being with people. He looked up. I was wrong, he said simply. I figured that out at the bottom of that creek bed. She looked at the fire. She thought about her own accounting. The choices that had brought her to an isolated slope in the Cascades, the way she had stopped returning letters, the way she had answered people's concern with silence until they stopped reaching out. She had told herself the same story, that she was better alone, that the wilderness was easier than people because it was honest about what it wanted to do to you. I burned every letter I got for 2 years, she said, without really meaning to say it aloud. After I came up here, I didn't want to line back. I know, he said, not condescending, just acknowledging. I still think that was right, she said, testing the words. Maybe it was, he said, for a while. They sat with that for a bit, the fire doing its work, the wind doing its work outside. When I heard you fighting, he said, his voice dropping lower. I recognized it. That particular sound. When someone's past asking for help and just trying to survive the next 60 seconds. He looked at her, his gray-green eyes steady in the firelight. I've made that sound, alone, when nobody could hear it. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I'm tired of being where nobody can hear me, he said. And I don't think you should be either. Mave looked at him for a long time. Her cynical mind went to work immediately, testing the story for hidden costs, checking the corners for the thing he wasn't saying. But the story held. It held the way true things hold. Not perfectly, not conveniently, but with the specific weight of something that had actually happened to an actual person and left marks. I burned my bread last week, she said. It came out sideways from what she meant, which was something closer to, I'm not easy, I'm not uncomplicated, I'm not the woman you're building in your head. He looked at her. "I've eaten burnt bread," he said. "Eaten worse." A small, unwilling thing moved in her chest. She looked back at the fire. "There's a proper cot frame in the barn loft," she said, "if you're going to stay." He nodded once. He didn't make anything of it. He stayed. The week settled into something she didn't have a word for. Not comfortable. That wasn't quite right. More like the specific ceasefire between two people who have both survived too much to perform ease they don't feel. She stopped bracing when she heard his boots on the porch. He stopped asking permission to do the things that obviously needed doing and just did them, which was both maddening and a relief. He taught her how to read the snow for weight, how to judge when the roof needed clearing before the ice pack built past the ridge beam. She showed him where the south-facing trail shortcut was, the one that wasn't on any marker, that she had found by accident in her second winter, and that cut 40 minutes off the run to the lower trap line. He used it. He didn't make a point of it. He just came back 40 minutes earlier than she'd expected. She noticed. She didn't say anything. He went to town for flour and hardware on a Thursday, taking the wagon and the draft horse and the list she handed him without comment. She watched the wagon roll down the logging road and disappear into the firs, and then she stood on the porch in the cold for longer than was practical before going back inside. She didn't sleep well for 3 nights. On the third day she was out behind the barn splitting kindling, more than she needed, just to have something to do with her hands, when the crows went up. Not 1 or 2. All of them. Every crow on the eastern ridge launched into the air at once in a black eruption of wings and noise, filling the gray sky, screaming in that particular crow alarm that didn't mean weather or predator, but meant human and moving and wrong. Mave dropped the splitting axe. She ran for the cabin. She got the Winchester from over the door, checked the load, went to the window, and looked out through the gap in the curtain. 4 horses. Coming down the logging road. She recognized Yellow Slicker's horse before she recognized Yellow Slicker, because the horse was distinctive, and she had been looking at it from the floor of her own home 3 weeks ago, while a boot was on her wrist. Yellow Slicker rode in the center of the group now, not the lead. The 3 men flanking him wore the kind of expressions that told her they were paid for this particular outing, which meant they were worse than drifters looking for opportunity. Paid men had a job to finish. She counted the weapons she could see. 6, minimum. Probably more she couldn't. Maeve's jaw tightened. She thought about the back door, the tree line, the 40-minute trail. She thought about leaving, just going, right now. Leaving the cabin and the barn and the 3 years she'd poured into this land and surviving, which was the only thing she'd ever been reliably good at. She was still running the geometry when she heard the wagon. It came up the south-facing shortcut trail, which was not visible from the logging road. She heard the horse first, and then the creak of the wheels, and then the wagon emerged from the tree line at the top of the yard, and Boone was on the bench with the reins in his hands and a 100-pound sack of flour at his feet, and he saw the 4 riders in the same moment they heard him. Yellow Slicker turned. Mave watched Boone's face as he took in the situation. She watched him assess it, watched him set the brake on the wagon with one smooth pull, wrap the reins around the handle, and stand up from the bench. Run, she thought fiercely through the glass and the distance and the cold air between them. Get back in the trees. You didn't ask for this. Boone reached behind the bench seat and came up with the long-barreled rifle she had seen him carry on the trap line. He did not run. Yellow Slicker, he said, his voice carried across the yard without any apparent effort. You've got 2 choices. Turn those horses around right now, or don't. Yellow Slicker stared at him. Then he looked at the 3 men with him, and something passed between them. The private arithmetic of men calculating odds. And she saw the moment it resolved wrong. Mave kicked the cabin door open and stepped onto the porch. She didn't think about it. The thinking had happened somewhere below conscious decision, in the same place that had kept her alive in this cabin 3 weeks ago, and in the 2 years before that, and in the life before this mountain that she didn't talk about. the part of her that had refused, that had kept fighting past reason, past hope, past sense. It made the decision, and the rest of her followed. She raised the Winchester. "She's inside," Yellow Slicker said, startled. "She's on the porch," Mave said, "with a rifle, and a considerably better angle on your left flank than you think." What followed was not elegant. Gunfire rarely is. The first shot came from the hired man on the far right, aimed at Boone. She heard it as she was already tracking, already squeezing the trigger. A shot hit the man in the shoulder of his gun arm, and he dropped the revolver and grabbed for his horse's mane, and the horse made that decision for both of them, bolting into the trees. Boone's rifle cracked twice, deliberate and unhurried. One man down, one wheeling his horse in panic, firing wild, a shot that buried itself in the porch post 2 feet from Mave's head and showered her with bark. She didn't flinch. She sighted and fired again, and the man chose the tree line the way sensible people choose exits. Yellow Slicker fired at Boone, and the shot caught him across the outer edge of his left arm. She could tell from the way he shifted his weight, a quick, sharp adjustment that he controlled immediately and didn't let change his footing. He fired once more. Yellow Slicker's horse went out from under him. He hit the frozen mud badly. He tried to get up. He didn't make it all the way. Silence came back to the yard in stages. First the echo of the last shot fading into the trees, then the horse's panic quieting into distance, then just the wind and the ringing in her ears and the smell of powder smoke drifting through the cold air. Mave lowered the Winchester. Her legs were unsteady beneath her, and she locked her knees and breathed through it. She looked at Yellow Slicker on the ground, who was conscious and wasn't going anywhere. She looked at the yard, at the damage, at the frozen ruts churned up by the horses. Then she stepped off the porch and walked across the yard toward the wagon. Boone had climbed down from the wagon bed and was standing at the draft horse's head, checking the animal over. He looked up when he heard her boots on the ground. His left sleeve was dark from elbow to shoulder. "You're hit," she said. "Grazed," he said. She reached him and looked at his arm without asking permission. The wool of his coat had been opened along the outer edge and the skin beneath it, but it was shallow. He was right that it was a graze, which was different from meaning it wasn't serious. "You came back up the shortcut," she said. "Faster," he said. "You saw the horses on the road. Saw the crows first." She stood in the cold, holding his arm and looking at the dark stain spreading into the wool, and felt something turn over in her chest, slow and large, like a stone moved by water. She thought about what it cost a person to come back. She thought about what it cost to come back from the tree line instead of going through it. She had spent 3 years building distance, building walls that were subtler than logs and harder than iron. She was very good at it. She had come to think of it as strength, the ability to need nothing, to ask nothing, to expect nothing from anyone at the end of a long road. She was beginning to understand that she'd been wrong. "You need to come inside," she said. "I have to boil water and clean that arm." "I'm all right," he said. "I know you are," she said. "Come inside anyway." He looked at her for a moment, this woman who had just walked out of a log cabin during a gunfight with her chin up and her hands steady, and something in his gray-green eyes shifted, the same careful distance she recognized from her own mirror. She watched it move, not disappearing but making room. He came inside. She boiled water. She cleaned the wound with whiskey and the particular brisk efficiency of someone who has patched themselves up enough times to have a system. And he sat on the chair and let her without making it difficult. She could feel him watching the top of her head while she worked. "Why did you come outside?" he asked quietly. She tied off the bandage with a firm knot. She didn't answer right away, because the true answer was the kind that took a moment to form. "Because you were standing in the open," she finally said, like a man who expected to do this alone. He was quiet. "You're not alone out here," she said, not quite looking at him. "Not anymore." The words landed differently than she'd expected, simpler, less frightening than they had been in her head. where she'd been carrying them in various forms for weeks now. He didn't make anything dramatic of them. He just accepted them, the way he accepted most things, without ceremony, without conditions, without requiring her to be different than she was. Outside, the wind was doing its early winter work on the ridge, stripping the last of the season's color from the alders. The fire in the stove was steady. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and burnt black powder and the dried herbs she kept bundled from the rafters. "I'm going to need to ride to town," she said, "and speak to the sheriff about the men in the yard. I'll go with you." She looked at him then. He was sitting with his bandaged arm resting on the table, watching her with those steady, unremarkable eyes that she'd learned in the past weeks contained entire continents of calm. "All right," she said. She put a second cup on the table and poured coffee into both of them. The small, ordinary domesticity of the gesture felt immense to her in a way she didn't try to explain, because some things didn't need explaining to someone who had spent 5 years at the bottom of a mountain and knew with their whole body the difference between the quiet that empties you and the quiet that holds. She sat down across from him. They drank their coffee in the firelight, the storm building outside, the cabin holding against it the way good things hold, not by being impervious to pressure, but by being built solid enough and warm enough, and not alone. If this story of survival, grit, and two people who had forgotten what it felt like to have someone in their corner moved something in you, hit that like button and subscribe to Mountain Haven so you never miss what comes next. Drop a comment below. Would you have stepped out onto that porch or stayed behind the walls? We'll see you on the next trail.